Going further, they have a few others like my modal journal, the Restats. Then they go down to 0.3, and then they go down to, here's 0.2, the China Quarterly, the Canadian Journal of Economics. Here are the new AEA journals. My guess is those will wind up being weighted higher in the next year or two. And here we're down to 0.2. They go down to 0.05. In other words, I like this system. It's arbitrary. It's, I think, Professor Ursprung at Bose, whatever it is, Constance, Heinrich Ursprung, cooked this up. I don't think it's very bad. It has the virtue of saying, you know, it's not just all or nothing. And the world doesn't work all or nothing. But there are weights, and the weights seem to be, I think, fairly consistent with that. So I think that's quite reasonable. Okay? I don't know how the guy got this. It seems arbitrary, but it accords with my prejudices, so it must be right. Okay? Now look, it is very hard to publish in this business. As I said, I've turned down more often than not, and I've discovered that that's not atypical. It's funny, I don't know if any of you have colleagues who are in the hard sciences, like physics or chemistry. In my case, my father was a mathematical physicist. And I remember telling him I just got a paper rejected by a journal. And he said, looked at me as if I was a complete idiot. He said, you know, how could you do that? I said, Dad, in our field, you know, you're rejected most of the time. It turns out in physics, chemistry, the majority of papers that are submitted are published. In economics, and I discovered in the social sciences, it is not true. So what I've done here is collected data on acceptance rates at various journals in 2008. These are either from email exchanges with editors, where they did this for me, or in a few cases, the journal prints on its website or in the journal a list of its acceptance rates. And here's the AER, 7% chance of a paper being published there. This does not include the May issue, the Papers and Proceedings issue, which is a purely who you know. It doesn't count, it's not refereed. If you know somebody, they'll put you on a program and they might publish the paper. Econometrica, 9%, JPE, 5%. The QJE is the lowest of all. The editor was very proud to point this out to me. They're 4%. Okay. And the reason, of course, is very simple. First of all, there's no charge to submit there. There's no submission fee. And secondly, they'll turn down half the papers within a day or two. A desk reject. Indeed, I would give this paper a few months ago at Maastricht, this discussion a few months ago at Maastricht. And one person raised his hand and said, he had his paper turned down before it was submitted. You might ask, how could you do that? And of course, it's real time versus nominal time. He submitted it from Europe, okay, and it was turned down within 4 hours. So it came back submitted before, rejected before submission. But in real time, it also happened. I had a student of mine on a Sunday at lunchtime submit a paper to QJE. It was rejected at 3 p.m. Sunday. Okay? So they're very fast, and not surprisingly, if it's a low-cost submission, more people do it, and they get a lot of them. Here's one, the Berkeley Electronic Press. People familiar with that? No? It's an online journal, and they have 4 tiers. It's really quite neat. They have 4 tiers, and they'll put you either in the top, second, third, or fourth tier. So the first time I submitted there, I was convinced that they must publish everything, and I was rejected. So I figured this must be the worst paper ever. But in fact, as you can see, for any of their tiers, they only publish half of them. They have these tiers: frontiers, advances, contributions, and topics. Fact. It's a nice mnemonic device for that. And the top tier is like 1% of submissions. Even the the third tier is only 20%. So that's even hard. Economica, 11%. Michael and I were just talking about that. The European Economic Review, 10%. Here's my journal, 18%. Jolly, 8%. These numbers are really low. What's really interesting is I did this exact same little survey for 2002. What's happened to these acceptance rates over those 6 years, do you think? Every single one went down. every single one. And I was asking this editor of the Canadian journal over there why he thought this was. And he volunteered. What's happened is that the profession has widened. In other words, when I started out in economics, which is the mid-60s, it was an American/English profession. And over the last 30 years, until 10 years ago, it widened to be an American, English, and Northern European. It's now widened to be essentially a worldwide profession. So he said the CJE's acceptance rate has not fallen from submissions from the usual old sources. It's just they're getting more and more submissions from other places where people hadn't before submitted. But there's no question overall, these numbers are all falling. I was at a session a year ago with a bunch of editors, and I was talking to the guy who edits this journal, which is the AER equivalent for political science, and this journal, which is the AER equivalent for sociology. And look at their numbers, and compare them to the AER. Those numbers are the same. The same problem exists in the other social sciences as well. In other words, in social sciences, it is just really hard to publish in the top journals. So going back to the first page here, life is tough, okay? It is really hard to publish in this business. Okay? And I'll give you some advice on how to cope with these difficulties. This is coping advice. First of all, though, what to work on. Where do you get your ideas from? Okay? I've seen people who obviously get their ideas sort of like the birth of Athena from the head of Zeus. You know the story. She sprang full blown from the head of Zeus. You know, that's really good. That's really greatly original. I mean, Zeus cooked her up and now she popped. Okay? The problem with cooking up ideas that way is that you run the danger that the idea is completely unrelated to anything anybody else cares about. Okay? So, removed from the mainstream. So I don't know. On the one hand, that's a good way to get things. You're going to be original. On the other hand, you've got to be sure somebody else might care about it. I know, for example, I spent 4 years on the American Economic Review Board. If you look at the AER, it says editorial board. Ever seen those names? It doesn't mean anything. You have no control over anything whatsoever. It sounds very good. All you do is referee a lot of papers. And one of your jobs is to referee papers that the editor wants comments on, which are completely out somewhere in left field. American baseball expression. Okay. Nobody cares about them. Would you please write a letter saying why this is not going to make it? Okay. And those are clearly papers that somebody just wasn't in tune with the profession on. He thought they were good, but they were just completely out of it. Another way of getting ideas is a neat bit of data. You see something in some data set and you say, gee, nobody's ever thought about that in an economic context. And clearly, some people do more of this than others. In my own case, that's been an awful lot of my career. The sleep data, the sleep paper that Michael alluded to, that arose because I saw in some data set information on sleep and I thought it'd be fun to work on. Same thing for the beauty papers, which has now been a third of my career for the last 15 years. Again, I saw some data on beauty. So there's nothing wrong with that. I mean, you can do some original work on that. But again, might people care about it? Next, a reflection on the literature. Well, that's, that ties you into what's going on in economics, but the problem is, of course, are you just being derivative of what has been done before? Still worse, should you write a reflection or comment on one paper? It's very easy for graduate students to do this. I didn't like something in this paper I read, I'm going to write a comment on it. Don't do that. Okay? When I was in the profession starting out in the 60s, the journals all had sections for comments, reply, and rejoinder. You remember this. If you notice, those have diminished like crazy. There's very little of that. And the reason is it's a pure example of the market working. Over the years, it became clear to editors that nobody wanted to read that rubbish and nobody commented on it. And it's a very nice study of this, that those comments and replies got many fewer references than did real papers per page. So why waste journal space publishing comments? And you shouldn't waste your time publishing comments. Okay? Don't write comments.